Both sides of my family were from the coal mining regions of eastern Kentucky and adjacent southwest Virginia. So I could say that my father grew up in Hazard, Kentucky, a little mountain town that got fairly big during the war, maybe 10,000 people. Finally settled out at about 4,000 people. About 50 or 60 miles away, you cross Harlan County and go over a mountain, and the top of the mountain is the Virginia state line. A few miles down into Virginia is a town called Pennington Gap, and that's where my mother grew up as one of 8 children of coal miner, underground miner, and their mother, who, for my life, is called Grandma. I would say Grandma was the biggest influence on me in my formative years. She just stamped herself, and it's I feel her. My sister and I talk about this. Her experience was the same. Um, so, um, so my mother was from over there in Virginia. My father was from over in Kentucky, but it was the same mountains and coal seams between them. And in 1928, they were both 18, and they both landed at a little college down at Cumberland Gap. And Cumberland Gap is the famous historic passage, considered a gateway on the westward movement, one of many. And and so Kentucky, Virginia, and Tennessee all meet at this spot. And so that Cumberland Gap and that little college campus, Lincoln Memorial College, has been just a power point on my personal map all my life. And I have, many things just turn into metaphors for me as I think about them for long periods. And since my parents met there in 1928, nobody had cars, nobody had any money, there was no money. And so the idea of a date was that you took a Sunday walk. And the first date, I asked my mother all about this. Their first date was a Sunday afternoon walk down into the lowest point, where there's a little village, Cumberland Gap, and then up the other side, and all the way up to a very high point overlooking all 3 of these states. So, and then the fact that their marriage was off to a very good start, but the tragedies of life struck them pretty hard, and so I was born in 1937. By the time I was 5, World War II had begun, and my mother had returned from Kentucky back to Virginia, and my father went off to the Army in 1943, and we never were reunited. So, so I have to say that the little town of Pennington Gap and this hillside farm and the little county seat town of Hazard seemed destined to never be in balance or come together. And as the years went by, I had grandparents there in Kentucky, grandparents in Virginia. And as the years went by, we kids just sort of bounced back and forth between these 2 places. And it was about a 60-mile road trip, but around many curves. So it was a long trip to go 60 miles in those days, in those mountains on 2-lane roads. And so if you ask me where I grew up, I have to say those 2 places stake out this region that I call a home place. And so it's not just either town or village, it's all the roads between. And because from the earliest, from infancy, I was hauled back and forth between these two places, and it's all mountain roads. And I feel like I certainly know all the names of all the major streams that run through that part of the country. I have this landscape basically imprinted in my mind. I can at any time visualize it from a satellite. I just think, go into my thinking, look down, and there it all is, the landscape of my early life and my family. And that was the beginning of what I would call my regional consciousness. And you've been with me, John, a lot in eastern Kentucky, and driven on many of these roads. And so you know how basically obsessed I've always been with it. And that's what's behind much of my writing and so forth. My mother finished college and became a school teacher. And she and my dad, he didn't go to college. He was down at this little campus to take a one-year course in bookkeeping. So he wasn't a college student, but he lived in the dorms, and they, two kids, 18, on this little college campus. But he didn't pursue any further education. And their great problem was, among many problems, is, for one thing, their courtship was long distance. They met in 1928, and in 1934 got married, and they were both 24 by then, I think. And but they didn't see each other much over those years. Maybe once or twice a year, and they wrote letters. And so it was in 34, was at the very height of the Depression. And, just to get a hold of a nickel was difficult. It basically was just barely a cash economy in many places across the land. But it's hard to imagine right now how limited everybody's range was. You planned for days to take a 60-mile bus trip. You had to get a lot together to go 60 miles. And so they never owned a car, for example. My mother moved to Kentucky and started teaching school. And my dad's intentions to have some kind of white-collar job did not pan out. And so he started working in the coal mine nearby. So he was a coal miner for 10 years until he went off to the war. But see, coal mining was, it operates in, the coal industry operates traditionally in what they call a boom and bust cycle. Something will happen with the world economy, or war it creates a great need for energy, which is coal, which coal is. And the Depression was a big bust, so the mining was only about 2 days' work a week for the miners. Barely held on. And of course, this was the time in the 30s, when the efforts to create labor unions, the United Mine Workers, as a union to represent the workers in terms of pay and the workplace safety and so forth. And there were bloody battles, historic battles, and to enter in, say, the computer, Kentucky coal mine wars would bring up incredible information. And I found out later that years and years later that in 1932 there was a huge strike in Harlan County. A couple of thousand miners were laid off, and they were trying to form a union, and but they had no means to survive. So, you know, in the way that we would imagine now, good-hearted people from across the country sent, you know, goods, money, whatever, to try to get food for these people who are living in tents, by the way. And so this was in the national news, and finally some writers from up east decided that they wanted to go and see why there was starvation in America in that time period. These writers had all published novels. They were becoming very prominent in American letters. And this book was issued in some kind of a limited edition. And there was a modest reprint of this book by a university, not a university press, but somebody down in Tennessee. 30 more years went by, and you can't find this book. But at the university, I worked closely with the director of the university press. And he's a young guy and very dynamic, and he calls on me to show him around the state. He's only been there about 4 years now, and to point him toward writers. And a year ago, and this is the kind of thing that I enjoy so much because I've been around so long and can work behind the scenes. I went to Mr. Wren is his name, and said, "Look, there's a book. You've got to bring it back into print." And he hadn't heard of it. And I said, "It is Harlan Miners Speak." And he immediately recognized the writers' names, and this was a whole era of American labor history that he hadn't heard of. From my earliest memories, I would go around the mines, and you know, in a coal camp, a big mining company would have a camp, and up a hollow would be rows of worker houses, just little thin, unpainted, uninsulated houses for miners and their families. Maybe a couple hundred families lived there around this little community called Allays. And so in the middle of any camp like this, I'm sure it's true in all the mining, copper mining, everywhere there's mining, this sense of community, and especially when a little money is circulating. But there's the commissary, and this is sort of like a big, for its day, it was like the Walmart. Everything that you needed, you know, groceries, clothes, shoes, tools, everything. And in the worst of situations, when there was absolutely no work, this was a very dire situation because the corporation behind all of this would, when the mines would, I don't know, when money was scarce, let's put it that way, it was a terrible situation for the working people because the only place that the miners were not paid in money. They were paid in scrip, which is homemade money just for that company. And you'd have a piece of metal and it said $1. And so it wasn't that the miners got paid in cash and they could go into town and, you know, as anybody would, as any free person would. They were obliged, the only place that money was any good was at the company commissary. So that's the desperate downside of the whole idea of industry, not just coal, but it was a kind of an ultimate face-off between capital and labor, management and labor. It was, you know, right now in in Utah, there's been this big accident. And you notice they're local people who have a strong sense of community. And so those kind of industries, the workers feel close together. So I started going, but it never, it was, whatever the politics and the economics were, that situation that developed in Harlan County did not develop in this particular place. The worst that happened was that the work itself just shrank from, 5 days a week, 6 days a week to 1 and 2 days a week. So I started going around that mine and up on this big thing called the tipple. I mean, I was carried around there as an infant. And one of my favorite smells is the smell of burning coal, because it was everywhere. It was a sulfur smell, and it was everything was powered by coal.
And it's still there.
Yes, and all houses, all homes at that time, rich or poor, were heated by burning coal. It was just fire everywhere, smoke. I was 10 years old and still in the steam era. I lived the first 10 of my life in the steam age. The coal was hauled out by these mighty trains, and the trains burned coal and created the steam, and huge clouds of smoke and dust came out, and the sounds of trains and all this metal gears grinding and the sound of industry. It was rural industry. So I was imprinted by the life of coal from an early age, and it's still real to me. I think another way to think about my parents, I had an older brother and a younger sister. My brother died quite young in a car wreck. My sister is very much with us, and she is, I've been a member of her family. There are 3 kids, all of whom have kids, so we're very close. But my parents were married in 34, and by 44, my mother was committed to the mental hospital. My dad was off in the military. And so we kids, for the next several years, just lived with grandparents 18 months here and 6 months there. But it was a very benign situation. I mean, we didn't want for anything. We were very well cared for in this time. But what was lost, and I was 6 going on 7 in 44, what was lost was the nuclear family. And then the next frame of reference was the grandparents. And both sets of grandparents were viable people. And so there was no social safety net in those days, none. But the family, we kids were lucky, the family network was very strong. We kids lived with our mother's people, the music family of Southwest Virginia, from the summer of 44 till the end of 45. It's about 18 months. After we had been there, we lived in Kentucky, and then we came back, and my mother got a teaching job in the Virginia school system there in Lee County. And she rode a bus west to her school, and we little kids went into the town a few miles away on the school bus. I was in 2nd grade, and my brother was in 3rd. My sister hadn't started school. And then we didn't realize it. We kids, little kids, have no way to know what the inner life of your parents are, because parents are carrying a mighty load, And yet I had no idea that there was very much amiss, really. It all seemed like a big party to me. But my mother was clearly had been under stress for a very long time. And she taught elementary school. She had little 40 youngins hanging on her all day, and then came home, and there's 3 more. So she suffered I guess it all came to a head, and we could call it a nervous breakdown, whatever label we put on it. And so she was committed to the state hospital. And so there, her dad was gone, and suddenly mother was gone. And you know, this was just weird. But kids are pretty adaptable, you know. I mean, the grandparents did a good job, just providing stability for these periods of time. And so over there in Virginia, we were little farm kids, and so I just turned into a little country hillside boy. My grandparents owned about 30 acres, about 15 of that was in woods, and there was a 10-acre pasture, pretty steep land, and then 5 or 10 acres around the household. And both my grandparents were born. My granddad was born around 1884. My grandmother was born in 1890. Talking about my mother's people. And they were pure 19th century people in that they grew up in the old frontier way. And so the life around the place, even as late as the 40s, when modernity had arrived, and the war sped modernity along very rapidly. And so my granddad was a modern worker in that he went underground every day, but he had a senior position. So for one of his tasks he was the timekeeper for everybody else. So he was like a foreman underground, and he was good with numbers and so forth. So, but when he would come home, he would come back, and we had 2 cows, a couple of hogs, a few acres of corn, and a big garden, all the vegetables. There were blackberries all over that pasture. So the summertime was all about food preservation, and kids, we were all involved with this, including the hog killing. I got used to being around hog killing. Everybody had a job. My job was to keep the fire going under this huge kettle. And this kettle was used for many things, mostly to heat boiling water. And you had to have an outdoor fire to have that hot water. So the poor hog, having big and fat now, this would be in the fall of the year when the weather had turned cool. Out would come the hog out to the edge of the field there, and someone would shoot the poor thing in the head, and then it's a big bloody process. Soon the poor hog is hanging up by his hind legs, and by the end of the day, there's all this pork product. There's hams. By the end of the day, it looked like something that you might go to a store and find. So it had been transformed. And my grandmother and all the adults knew how to do this. They knew how to do everything. Every man of working age anywhere in this society was a mechanic, carpenter, plumber, farmer, could do all these things, and knew how to relate to work horses, mining ponies, how to doctor animals, and and then, milk twice a day. These were all chores and that had to be done. And they had raised 8 children in this old way. And while their children, which included my mother and her 7 brothers and sisters, they were born into the modern world. I mean, came into their teenagehood in the 20s, the roaring 20s, and there's such things as radios by then, movies. And that stuff didn't exist when my grandmother was young, for example. So it wasn't like these people who had these skills were ignorant, It was like they were brilliantly talented and knew how to make a living from the environment. I was around storytellers, just talkative people. Although when strangers would come, they would, fall silent and minimalize the encounter. The tradition was that if somebody locally in a family was just kind of off, like there were people who would walk up the street of the town and every 4th time their left foot hit the sidewalk, they would enunciate something. Mm-hmm. And that's bizarre, And it's not the same thing as nervous breakdown. It's just weirdness and maybe some physical capacity. But so visitors would come and they would see, in a daytime, 2 or 3 really odd-looking, misshapen people go by. So they go back to the city and they'll say, God, every other person down there is twisted, you see. But the point that should be taken is these people don't shut these people away.
Right.
See.
Yeah. I noticed that in Ethiopia as well.
Yes.
That
So
they
it's
take
very
care of their whatever little tribe happened to be, a little village.
Yeah, to make a place. Yeah. Well, anyhow, these are just sort of hints and details of a kind of a world, lost world, but that I got to experience fully, and about basic place of words. Everybody was quite a talker, as I said. And in Grandma's house, there were farming magazines, church-related booklets and things, a set of encyclopedias, and my aunts and uncles had gone to school, and their textbooks were all over the place, 20 years out of date or more. But there were books around, is the point. I believe it or not, I was a kind of a quiet, solitary kid. I could be on my own for hours. Another detail you might find interesting is in the mornings, I might have some little chore to do, but by 9 a.m. I've just gone off to myself into the woods, and the grown-ups wouldn't hear from me till noon, and so I was unsupervised, but I knew I had to be there at noon, so I would be playing in trees and in this little creek and imagining scenarios and games and heroism and so forth. And then the same in the afternoon, some more work to do probably. But then perhaps my brother and I would just disappear from the grown-ups. And nobody worried about us. Nobody gave it a thought.
Same with us.
And so we got used to being, kind of on our own, and developed confidence in that way. And then on Saturdays we went to town to the movies. And there was always a double feature, a Western, some kind of other maybe private detective movie, endless short subject type films. There was the newsreel. There was the comedy, a Disney thing probably. Then there was the serial. It's just 15-week series of the daring do of some hero. I mean, there was at least 30 minutes of short subjects before the first movie started. Then the second movie would come on, and then the kids would all go and get popcorn and stuff, and we'd do it all again. See the entire thing, all the stuff again. So we could spend like 5 hours in the theater in the summertime. I finally, as I got a little older, my brother and I got a bicycle, and we would ride this thing into town. I would sit on the whatever you call it, the side saddle. He would pedal, and we'd get to town, and then we would just set the bike against the wall and go into the movie. You didn't lock it or anything like that. So it was an innocent world in that sense. But I think it's important now to segue to a certain chapter of when the war was over. These uncles all came home. They'd all been in combat. They saw some serious stuff. My father did not go overseas. He was 34. Go overseas. He was 34 or 5 years old when he went into the military, and he trained with 18-year-olds. And in a way, it broke his health. So he came home, and then again then we moved back over to Kentucky, back to the coal camp, and lived there with their father's parents. Went on to school, I was in the 3rd grade by then, I think. And then when school was out, back to Grandma's in Virginia we would go, and just had this great outdoor existence, and would not wear shoes all summer. As a little boy, the only garment I would wear, it seemed, most of the time was just a little pair of short pants. That was it. No shoes, nothing. And I thrived in this atmosphere. But then in the summer of, then my dad came home from the war. His wife, my mother, was in the mental hospital, and we moved back to Kentucky. And then it was time for him to try to find work. Well, during the war, 4 years, the mines had totally mechanized, and there was no more need for the kind of manual labor. Like the coal mining was a pick and shovel thing. Drill a hole in the coal face, put a big dynamite back in there, blow the coal loose, shovel it into these cars. But that level of work was done, and so my father was fit a category of he was an obsolete worker. And then that's in this country, if you are a laborer, let's say in a factory, and you can't find work, in our great nation, it's always the worker's fault. It's an individual problem, and that's you can either make it in this country or you don't make it, and devil take the hindmost. But see, in Italy and Western Europe, it was not like that. If you couldn't find a job, then it probably meant that thousands of others, wouldn't find work. But no individual person on an assembly line would think that it's his fault. It's it's a problem of the system. And so you have 10 or 100,000 fellows in unions to protect against just total domination. And in the coal industry to this day, enlightened though it's all supposed to be, the coal industry will fight with all its power, spend billions to deny the workers an ounce of improvement in something like safety or health care. And that is a huge problem, and it's part of our system today. But the thing is, you know, we're not in an industrial era anymore, and so the whole era of large, powerful labor unions in the country, you know, is pretty much gone. But anyhow, my dad was in the union. I used to go to the union hall and stand around. There would be all these big miners, and on the weekends their faces would be clean, and I just loved to hang around with these working guys. So, but then by the summer of 46, my father's father, who had been the mainstay, he was the support in Kentucky. He was 65 years old, and he had a total health collapse. He just collapsed. And just like any miner who can't produce, you know, whether you're hurt or whatever, if you're a miner and you can't produce, your furniture's set out on the street, and you have to leave. And my granddad had been the manager of the store for 35 years. Great stories about how he came there in the first place. And, you know, as soon as he couldn't go to work, and he wore a tie and a cardigan sweater to work, much admired, soft-spoken man, he had a month to vacate his house, which was a company house. And so suddenly our Alley's life was over. We were just like kicked out. And my grandmother, which is to say my father's mother, was instantly declassed. That meant you're on some part of middle class, got some grip on middle class, and suddenly, boom, down you go. And she started working for 40 cents an hour in a department store and lived in a little apartment in the town of Hazard. And she was, you know, 58 years old. And what about us kids? Where are we going to go? Mother's still she was hospitalized for 12 years. My age is from 7 to 18. And so one day, my brother and I, we were all loaded into somebody's car, and my grandmother was driving, my dad was in the car, some lady, and we had been told that we were going off to school, but we didn't know what that meant. We couldn't grasp that. And so we were just happily riding along, although the car was packed with bags of bedding and pillows and clothes and, you know, all such things. And we drove about 30 miles deeper into the mountains up in Letcher County, where John has been, and where Sage lived a very significant part of her life in Whitesburg. That's Letcher County. Here's the Sage, the hillbilly. And the car was in after about an hour. Then we went off onto a gravel road for about 15 miles. We didn't know where we were. But suddenly we pulled up onto this place, and it was a school. And the first thing you saw was this broad athletic field. And then there was a kind of a schoolhouse-looking building over here, brick buildings back this way. And, you know, we learned quickly that this was a boarding school. And so my brother and I moved into the boys' dorm, took about half an hour. And across the way were a dorm full of girls. And so I think somebody helped us make our beds and that kind of thing. And then the adults got back in that green car and drove away. There we are.
How old were you?
9.
Oh my gosh, traumatic.
And the thing was, fortunately, it was a benign place. You know, whatever our horror stories we carry in our minds, maybe from the movies or reality. You know, you think of David Copperfield and
Right.
all of that. It was nothing like that. This was a very loving place, and you know, we suffered for 3 days, and then that was a Wednesday we arrived, 26 September 1946. And then we made it till Saturday, and on Saturday morning, my brother Jerry and I, 10 and 9, decided that we didn't like it and we were going to go to Chicago and get jobs. So we snuck off the campus and got down on the railroad tracks and early in the morning and started walking about 1.5 miles downstream to a little town called Blackie. And there was a railroad station. All the little towns on the railroad tracks had railroad stations. You know, you go in, sit down, wait for the train. And we got there, we were down there by 8 o'clock in the morning. And somehow we found out that the train going north didn't come through Blackie until 2 p.m. So here's a 9-year-old with 6 hours. And what I did was to amuse myself, I started climbing around on these trains and just examining the whole thing and getting off on a coal pile. So by about 10 a.m., I was totally dirty. I looked like a miner. I just had black all over me, clothes destroyed. And so my brother in his ancient wisdom, said, well, we can't go to Chicago with you looking like that. And our solution was that we would sneak back up the railroad tracks 1.5 miles, sneak back up on the campus, sneak back in that room, our room, and somehow I was going to get cleaned up and we would get clean clothes and still be back in Blackie by 2 p.m. to catch the train. And train travel was everywhere. It was so common. The public transportation system at the height of the coal industry, from about 1920 to 50, had a very sophisticated public transportation system, trains and buses, comparable to the Europeans, the way they just are so good with public transportation. So anyhow, we got captured when we got up there, and somehow there was one telephone in the entire lower half of this county. No telephones, but the one over in our school superintendent's office. And so somebody went over there and called our grandmother and our dad in Hazard, and the next day our dad came up and he brought us, my brother and I, each a rabbit's foot. And we got real excited about this rabbit's foot. And then he also brought us each a certificate. He had a couple of dollars. We were supposed to get $1 each. And he was great. He was very imaginative. And so instead of bringing us the cash, he bought 2 raffle tickets for a shotgun. And boy, that we might win this shotgun. I mean, we no longer wanted to run away. Suddenly things were looking up. I never heard any more about the shotgun, but it fired our imaginations, you see, and distracted us. And I stayed 9 years and really thrived there. My brother left after 5 years. And so this school was, I can't praise it enough, really, which is not to say it doesn't have were not downsides, you know, but it was a Presbyterian school. And in that instance, the Presbyterians had brought education into the mountains about 1910. Before railroads, before automobiles, before anything, they were there starting these schools. And and our faculty were these really fine people from the Atlanta area, so they were pretty sophisticated. And so I was surrounded by people who had, they were not minimally trained as teachers, but they had graduate degrees, and so we got a pretty sound high school education for the day.
Were they city folk?
They probably were suburban folks, but that church has a big headquarters in Atlanta. One of the reasons I say it was mild is that there was none of this enthusiasm. All these crazy people running around being enthusiastic about extreme religious stuff, And although what one might have called fundamentalist churches, there were around. I mean, it's not that such churches didn't exist, but we landed in this kind of an island and thrived real well. I grew up there, and still, though, in the summertime, went back to Grandma's in Virginia, and resumed my role as a country boy. And by the time you turn 10, you get inherit chores, and so. And I would say that for about then, 10, 11, 12, the reading, it seemed like the adults around, the men probably, were reading westerns, Zane Grey, and endless paperback westerns. And so my brother and I read all of those. And then I think 6 years went by, and my dad died in the Veterans Hospital, and shortly after that, my brother left the school because he just couldn't be contained. He was 16 and just already a man, and he just didn't want to put up with being monitored,
Right.
And so he left and finished high school.
You were 14?
I was 14 when he left, and so I stayed on at the school, did real well, just became the editor and the captain and all this stuff. And so that I'd say the big event then was in my sophomore year of high school. My dad died in 1953, and he'd been in the VA hospital for 3 years, and I'll just cite one detail just to show you the weirdness of some of this life. Is that my mother was in the state hospital in Lexington, and my dad was in the VA hospital in Lexington. And there was a time period when they didn't know where each other was, or were, however you'd say it. But I knew. But the family politics, like there was great enmity developed between the in-laws, the Kentucky people and the Virginia people.
Why do you suppose?
Well, because they each blamed the other for the tragedies of my mother and my father. And hysterical people and people with having to process tragedy, and you've got this daughter who's thriving and educated and become a teacher, and suddenly in the state hospital for 12 years. There's got to be a reason, and it wouldn't be a very sophisticated reason. It was those Kentucky people caused this, and vice versa. So anyhow, then we kids became pawns back and forth through. One time, I had some dental work done. I might have been 11. Over in Virginia in the summertime, I had a couple of teeth filled. And then I went back over to Kentucky, and the adults over there, particularly that grandmother, my father's mother, examined my mouth and said, "Oh my gosh, those Virginia dentists have ruined this boy." So I then had to have the dental work done again by Kentucky dentists. It was after my father died. I was 15, and within about a month, he died in January, and in about the 1st of March, I wrote a story. Curiously, my English teacher, Miss Ellis, encouraged me, but she didn't like the stories, but she liked it that I was doing it. And especially she didn't like it when it was time to give a book report. I gave a book report on my own stories. Well, after high school, I went up to the University of Kentucky in Lexington, where I began as a journalism major. I really liked journalism school. I found the student publications and began to write for the student newspaper and the yearbook. I became the editor of the yearbook, 1959. Famous issue. But also I gravitated to the English department and the creative writing classes. And I realized over in the creative writing classes that was where the personal writing could be done. That's where, journalism is public writing for the most part. You're writing about public matters for the public. Fiction, is an art form, and it's about being expressive, and you can probe the psyche and the soul and so forth. And so I guess I knew by the time I graduated that it was, I really, really knew. I knew when I was 15 I would be some kind of writer. My professor encouraged me to submit some of my student stories to a competition at Stanford University for the Wallace Stegner Creative Writing Fellowships that Stanford offered and still does. They have a very fine program. This was by now winter of 1960, and I applied, and sure enough, got a fellowship. And this, I think it was in April that I got word of this thing, and so I had until late August to really realize that I had this adventure in front of me. If we can just imagine the speed up of the camera, a little red car coming out of Kentucky, and by the magic of film, zoop! Suddenly we are in Nevada, and we're ready to go over the Sierras, and I'm driving my Ford, and unfortunately along the way I have stripped out my low gear, my first gear. So I set up, the map showed a direct road straight to the Bay Area. I started up, turned out to be an old logging road, but paved as a modern road. And I drove uphill on a winding road for 40 miles, and at last got within, 300 feet of the top of a mountain where a sign said, California. But my little car with no first gear would only get within 100 feet of the top. And so I tried mightily, and it just would not go over that mountain. So I backed the car down, and fortunately there was a little turnout, about half big enough to actually turn, but somehow I managed because I remembered someone had said that reverse gear is as strong as first gear. So I said, well, I'll just back over the Sierra Mountains. And I started back up the road with the mighty force and got back only within 50 feet of the top. And my car could go no more.
Even in reverse.
Even in reverse, it all stopped. And I said, aha, well, the smart thing for me to do is unload everything I've got in this car. And so I unloaded all kinds of stuff, my typewriter and all kinds of things, and went back down to the little turnout, decided to back up one more time. As soon as I tried it, I stripped out reverse gear. So now I had only second and third gear, and my car was pointed east. And the only way I could go was east in second gear. So I was in a quandary, and I stopped, and about every 15 minutes a car would come over there, local people, I guess, pickup trucks and stuff. And I waved and thumbed the cars, but nobody would stop. And though after about half an hour, this great young guy came over the mountains in a newish pickup truck, and he was probably 30 years old, and he was just, he just exuded confidence and competence. He said, "What's wrong? Got some trouble?" And I explained the situation. He said, "Well, jump in. We'll go back up and get all your stuff." Within half a minute, we got back up there, loaded all my stuff in his pickup truck, offloaded it back into my red car, and he said, "Follow me." And so I had a hero helping me, and I followed this guy down out of the Sierras, 40 miles, and I was coasting most of the way, and finally got down to the valley floor in Nevada, where this guy said, "Look, my brother's got a garage, he's a mechanic," said, "You could just go work for him for a few days and he'll fix your vehicle for you." And I said, "Well, I think," I tested my car, I said, "I've still got second gear." And so I thanked him and drove on, went north 100 miles to a modern highway out of Reno. And with only a second and third gear, I eased, with modern road design, graded properly. I got that car to go up over the Sierras. And then I coasted down to save gas and money, and landed in Palo Alto. And for the next 10 months, I drove my car with only 2 gears all over the place. I drove it to San Francisco, I drove it to Monterey, and people who, like, there would be parties, people would dread me coming because I would show up in this red car, and it meant that at midnight all the drunk males had to come out and push my car so it would turn. And so I had good luck. Malcolm Cowley was my teacher. Then in the spring, the Irish short story writer Frank O'Connor was my teacher for 2 quarters. And I thought I was going to write a novel, but I just discovered that I'm a short story writer. I can't write long things. I read stories in the class, and he was very helpful and very supportive. He told me that my accounts of Eastern Kentucky life reminded him of his stories about, lower class people in Ireland that he had written about.
Tell us something about your newspaper work.
Well, I had, in the summer times, between my junior year and then after my senior year at UK, I worked as a summer job at my hometown weekly newspaper, the Hazard Herald. And I was 20 years old when I started that summer job. And my job was to go out and interview people. I covered a murder trial at age 20. And I would talk to the judges. And here's a little anecdote about the spirit of the times in this rural eastern Kentucky county. We were in the murder trial, and Judge Wells was presiding. And I was seated up front and taking notes furiously throughout the whole thing. These two young guys were charged with murdering a woman by shooting through a plate glass window of her cafe and killing her. And so I took quotes. I was pretty good at capturing what people said and so forth. Finally, on the second day, I asked the judge, would he mind if I took pictures in the courtroom? He said, no, go ahead. Now, these pictures were with an old-fashioned Polaroid. They had a big, bright flash bulb. Flash! And then you had to wait 2 minutes. You're holding your camera. And then you have to lift the back and pull out the picture, which was part of a little negative type thing, and close the camera, put your camera down, and then you had to peel the photo off of the negative part, and then you had a little vial of a chemical. It was with a sponge, on a sponge. Then you had to coat your photograph. And all of that took like 4 minutes. And then I'd put it down. And if I didn't get a good picture, I had to go do it all again. And so it was quite a distraction. And I was worried, but I shot the two, they were pronounced guilty. And I took pictures of them and all the witnesses and the rounds. Well, the next day the trial was over. The boys were convicted. Everybody was starting to leave the courtroom. Judge Wells, high up on his place up there, said, Gurney, come up here a minute. And I thought, oh, God, am I going to jail? What have I done? And he said, well, now, Gurney, you've been taking a lot of pictures during this trial, and I wanted you to have that opportunity, you know. And he said, but you didn't take one of Mrs. Strong over here, the circuit court clerk. So really, you should take her picture too. That's the judge. And so I did. Oh, I'm sorry, Mrs. Strong. And I went over and did all this stuff, and spread this stuff on the photo. And but at last, I got a picture of Mrs. Strong. So I mean, that the judge would tell the 20-year-old reporter to take the picture of the circuit court clerk, Mrs. Strong. It just says something about the spirit of the times there. So.
Well, can you say something about the period you were sort of commuting between your Army base and the Palo Alto?
Well, I spent that year at Stanford among these writers, and in this writer class had a great time. In June, I returned to Kentucky, and I was waiting to go into the Army. And the Army took its time, and I had no money, no car, no job. So I hung out at my grandmother's over in Virginia. And I was by now about 22 years old, or 3 maybe. And I was allowed to live with my grandparents as if I was still 10 or 11 years old. I got to live there as a boy. No one asked me to wash a dish. I didn't have to do anything. And so I sat down in this little room and did a lot of writing. And finally the Army called me. Off I went, took my a sort of a basic training course in Fort Benning, Georgia, bought a Nash Rambler, and drove back to California. So I left California around June the 1st, and by mid-February, there I was, right back at Monterey, about 80 miles south of Stanford. And so I learned my Army duties and so forth. And on weekends, I would drive my Nash Rambler up Highway 101 to Perry Lane and hang around with the scene, the Perry Lane scene. So I was in the Army, which in effect gave me 3 years in California. I then went back to Kentucky, and this time I worked full-time for about 2.5 years for the Herald, and I was nominally the editor, but I was the only writer for it. I just wrote the whole thing. What would my life have been like if I had stayed in the newspaper business, stayed with that little paper, and the years, for a whole lifetime, a whole career? Because you remember the Gishes in Whitesburg and the Mountain Eagle? That's what they did, And but I was restless at the end of about 2.5 years, and my family, they thought, well, Gurney's got a good job. He's about to settle down. And they all wanted me to hook up with some lass and just be in the job I would have forever and be settled. And I was, by the time those last months with the newspaper, after I had just turned 28, and I made a big decision, and I told my grandparents that well, I'm leaving Kentucky. What? I said, yes, I'm going to go to Connecticut. And what? What are you going to do there? I said, well, I've got a job as a babysitter. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to go up there and and babysit for this family and get on with my fiction writing. God, they flipped out. Because, basically, especially among working class people, to have a good job, you don't mess with that. You do not leave a good job, no matter what it is. And so I just, with supreme confidence, I just did the next thing. And after a winter up there in Connecticut, I applied for a job with the U.S. Forest Service in Oregon, and got the job and moved to Oregon for the summer. And that was on Sisai Butte out here in the Cascades, in the Mount Hood forest. So I did that 2 summers, and it was a grand adventure. Then I decided to, at the end of the season, I decided to drop down to Palo Alto and Menlo Park and just see my old friends before I drove on back to Kentucky. Chloe and I became very close, and in the mix at like 67 in the Bay Area was a heck of a time and a place. And so one of the counterculture was just about to burgeon. And one of the neighbors, a friend in Chloe's circle, was Stuart Brand. He started a Whole Earth catalog, and because of my editing experience and journalism experience, I was of some help to Stuart. I reviewed books and edited a couple of issues of a thing called the supplement to the catalog. And then I won't have time now because it involves quite a bit of detail. But in the fall of '69, after 2 or 3 years of raging success with this catalog thing, Stuart announced that he wanted to go out of business because it was just like a runaway train, and there was my guess is that we were making too much money, and so
he called for suggestions as to what to do with the money.
Yes, there was a meeting of some of the volunteers, and we offered our suggestions, and so I said, I think the Last Whole Earth catalog ought to have a novel in it. And Stuart said, fine, will you write it? I said, yeah. One of the people at the table, this guy, I just can't quite remember his name, Steve. His name is Steve. And he had been part of a lot of kind of back to the land stuff out in the Taos area. They were building communes and stuff. And he told a story about his one of his great grandfathers who was in the wagon trains, you know, coming along in I don't know, mid 19th century, and the guy's the old man's name was Divine Right. That was his name. And then I took a few minutes at this meeting to summarize what the story would be. And I was just kind of making it up. I said, well, there's going to be this hippie named Divine Right, and he's, you know, on a journey across the country and so forth. So it was that sudden, and I had so much fun writing that book because it was made up. I just pulled it out of my head. And when I've worked on more personal stuff, stories that I remember that have a basis in history, it's harder going. And I don't know why, but I've never quite, again, found the freedom to just invent out of whole cloth characters and scenarios, and I've been too involved with autobiography. And but to be back in Oregon and out on the West Coast in general connects me back to that old spirit.